Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Catherine Coyle. I'm the Planning and Urban Design Manager for the City of Tampa. Really quick, I would like to acknowledge the members of the Natural Resources Advisory Committee and those of the city staff's internal technical working group for attending. Their participation in this is essential for the city moving forward with our urban forest management plan. I will turn this over to our introductory speaker, Mr. McDonough. He is our Economic Opportunity Administrator for the city.
Good evening. Again, I'm Bob McDonough. Thank you very much for taking the time. I know it's after work. Everybody would rather be home eating dinner or watching TV or doing both. But this is important. You know, we've spent a lot of time, and I think what you're going to learn this evening is that we have approached this in a scientific manner. Again, we're trying to get away from opinions, because gosh knows if there's 50 people in here, we have 50 opinions about exactly how everything works. But we're going to talk about a lot of different things. You know, we do have a very robust urban canopy, but we've learned a lot of things about it. You know, one of the things is that we could use a little more diversity. With the yellowing disease that's out there, if you have certain species of palm trees, maybe you wish you had something else. If you owned Anodidia palms, Christmas palms, you found out around Christmas time that they don't really like cold weather. You found out during the hurricane season that even though we didn't have a real hurricane, our oak trees don't necessarily like hurricanes. And so one of the things that people are going to be talking about is a broader look at some species that maybe we don't use as often as we could. And some of the benefits. You know, obviously we know about soil erosion. We know about the fact that it can help in remediating flooding because of the absorption of water through the trees. We know that it can aid in air quality, although I know a lot of people in here who have allergies can test that mightily from the spring that we had. But we have a very qualified board here that's going to speak with us this evening. First, we have Dr. Andrew Kozer. He's the Assistant Professor of Tree and Landscape Management at the University of Florida's Gulf Coast Research and Education Center in Hillsborough County. Dr. Kozer holds 2 degrees from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a PhD in crop sciences and biometry, Masters of Science in Natural Resources and Environmental Science. Dr. Kozer also earned a Bachelor's of Science in Urban Forestry from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. My son Martin spent about the approximate same amount of time at Florida State and barely escaped with a bachelor's degree. So it all depends on how you use your time. Dr. Kozer is an ISA board certified master arborist and an ISA qualified tree risk assessor. In his research and extension efforts, Dr. Kozer looks for ways to increase the health and longevity of trees in urban areas while reducing any risk associated with trees with compromised structural integrity. And that's a fancy way that we've talked about when we talk about pruning trees. What's safe and what's not safe. What can we do, what can't we do, especially with a lot of the large ones when we talk about root pruning. Can we do it, can't we do it? Dr. Shawn Landry, he's a research professor with the University of South Florida School of Geosciences, director of USF Water Institute at the University of South Florida. Dr. Landry's work focuses on the spatial and temporal dynamics of human-environmental interactions related to urban ecosystems, including the forest. And I might stick around just to understand what that means. And then last but not least, Rob Northrop. Rob works as an extension forester for the University of Florida. His work involves teaching urban and community forestry to natural resource and landscape professionals, providing conservation planning and assistance to local, state, and federal governments, and applied research into the changing character of the Tampa Bay watershed's urbanizing forest. So Mr. Northrop will be our first speaker, and he's going to provide some background about this long-range plan that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure I'll need the microphone, but it's good to see you all here. Hope it wasn't too hard getting in. So the City of Tampa's Urban Forest Ecological Assessment provides a detailed scientific look into the economic and ecological values of the City of Tampa's urban forest. The City of Tampa Ordinance requires re-inventory of Tampa's tree canopy and urban forest every 5 years. So we're going to talk about the one that was begun in 2016. There have been 2 previous ones conducted. The presentation you'll see today provides an introduction to the 2016 report. The report itself provides detailed information about the condition of the urban forest, as well as how the forest and associated benefits have changed since 2011. Included is detailed information about the distribution of Tampa's tree canopy cover, results of extensive field sampling that describe forest composition, the structure, that is how the trees are actually themselves structured physically, okay, their health, and some of the model results that quantify economic benefits and the ecosystem services, that is the work that these trees and urban forest patches do for our community. I want to just point out very quickly that my colleagues and I are here, the 3 of us. We have been the ones, along with our colleagues that work with us at the University of South Florida and the University of Florida, who have led this latest report, but there are many people who in fact have been helping us, including people from the Florida Forest Service and the U.S. Forest Service. So this is an operation that takes a good bit of coordination, and we get some good help. So a little bit of background. The region once was covered by extensive forests. Upland pines, primarily intermixed with wetland forests of cypress, hardwoods, coastal mangroves, interior wet prairies that we don't talk about very much anymore because most of them are gone, and of course numerous oak species that we would find on the drier sites. The colored map you're looking at up on the left was developed to depict the vegetation from 1820. This was about 30 years before there was some serious development, if you will, building, even if the buildings were more temporary, within what is now the city of Tampa. At that time, this is pretty interesting, I thought so anyway, at that time in 1820, downtown Tampa was a dry oak hardwood forest. Okay? Channelside district was a salt marsh. South Tampa was covered in pine, interspersed with wet prairie, marshes, and wet hammocks. Hyde Park was a grassy scrub. East Tampa was almost entirely pine forest. West Tampa was dotted by marshes and cypress and wet hammocks. And North Tampa had extensive wetlands, cypress strands, wet prairies, hammocks, and marshes. I point these things out only because we need all of us to understand, and we appreciate this too, is that things are constantly changing. Things don't remain the same. Very often we would like to be assured that we were going to get the exact outcomes that we always want when we do something. But in fact, in terms of these systems of vegetation, soils, climate, water, and wildlife for that matter, all of the decisions about what happens are not in our hands. Okay? So there's a lot of change. It's a dynamic ecological system. So what we have today then in Tampa is an urbanized forest. The Tampa city itself still exists within that geologic and climatic context in which those forest types and those wet prairies and those marshes and those mangroves existed in the past. They simply have been modified by the land uses that you and I impose. So the urbanized forests then are those patches of the native forest that still exist. They still exist in some of our parks. Some of the trees from those native forests that still exist. We found a couple just last year in a little parkland associated with a retirement home in Ybor. The trees are probably 300 to 400 years old. Okay, so even in the city, there are the old patches. We always think of nature as being out there someplace. They always think of the important stuff as being out there someplace. Couldn't be in the city. But we're very quickly finding out that a lot of what is important about the landscape in terms of its ecology, in terms of its health, in terms of its functioning, in terms of the ecological processes that keep plants and animals alive and provide us with benefits, actually do exist right here in the city. So, of course, along with those patches of native trees and native forests, as part of our urbanized forests, all the trees that we've planted, the shrubs we've planted, the palms we've planted on private and public land. Now, it was in listen to me, I'm getting a little old here. Hey, it was back in the 1700s. No, not really, it was back in 2006. That the City Council recognized that sustainable management of the urban forest really required a deliberate and scientific monitoring in order to ensure that the city's urban forest management programs and public policies and regulatory policies were effective and efficient. It was at that time in 2006 that they ordered the initial urban forest inventory and ecological analysis. And that's when my colleagues and I, along with our good friend up at the University of Florida, Michael Andrew, began to have this long-term collaborative relationship with the city of Tampa. So we conducted that initial ecological analysis. It looked a bit like what you're going to see tonight. The numbers were a little different, the techniques were a little different, but we approached it in basically the same manner. We took the outputs from that analysis and brought it to the executive branch of government. They were fairly impressed. They had not thought about the forest as truly being an asset. It was always seen, of course, as an aesthetic value, but not necessarily one that was an asset in terms of things like stormwater or air quality. And so the mayor asked that we make this presentation in public. And so in 2008, we held the Mayor's Symposium on Community Trees and Urban Forests at the Convention Center. I believe there were 150, 175 people, something along that order, everywhere from the vice presidents of banks and TICO and other forms of large businesses to everyday folks coming out of their neighborhoods. It was at this forum that it was decided through these people held in a series of dialogues, came up with important steps that needed to be taken in order to ensure the sustainability of Tampa's urban forest. One of them was to hire an urban forester. They did it. The other was that everyone there believed that the value of the urban forest was such that it was not reasonable to not have a true plan to manage it. Okay? And this also comes out of what the City Council was suggesting when they asked for that initial assessment. So, in 2008, 2009, the mayor, through Parks and Recreation, appoints a steering committee on urban forest sustainability that represents business, local citizens' interests. And again, my colleagues and I guided them through 4 different sessions in which they built consensus about a vision and goals for the urban forest. This vision and goals then became the foundation for what became the Urban Forest Management Plan. We never deviated over the next 3 years, in which we had many, many consultations in and outside of government, public meetings with those visions and goals. The plan that you now have that is being implemented is based upon that vision and goals that was initially set forth by the steering committee. In 2011, we conducted the second of these forest inventories and ecological analyses, and we began the development of the Urban Forest Management Plan. In 2013, November 2013, the City Council adopts the Urban Forest Management Plan through resolution. Okay? In April of 2014, the mayor issues an executive order to government suggesting that ordering that the urban forest management plan should be implemented. So, this is kind of what it looks like. I'm going to give this to you pretty quick because I just want to make the connection between this urban forest management plan that you have, okay, and the analysis that you're going to look at in just a minute. This is what the plan looks like in a diagrammatic way. It has 31 key objectives. 31 key objectives. That is 31 critical things that need to be achieved if we intend for the urban forest of Tampa to be sustainable. It doesn't mean you can do these instantly, okay? Conservation is an endless process. We're dealing with living systems. We're not dealing with engineered systems where you make them and then they have a life and then you take them down and you put new ones up. That's not what we're talking about here, right? So the implementation plan, so the plan itself is about 20 years long. It reflects the timelines for changes in the comprehensive plan. It also takes into account the fact that there has to be some continuity in management over the long haul. The 20-year plan is broken down into 4 5-year implementation plans, that is action plans. This is where the actions come in. Each one of those actions then, each one of those action plans is developed with the intent of moving the city closer to achieving those 31 key objectives. Okay? Not solving every problem instantly, just getting closer there. And at each one of those 5-year increments, when they're going to create a new action plan, the urban ecological analysis comes first. It gets done. We see what's happened over the last 5 years, and then we say, okay, now what are we going to do in the next 5 years? Where did things work? Where are things not working well? Where did things not work at all sometimes, right? This is an incredibly honest approach to urban forest management. It's an incredibly open and transparent approach to the management of any resource. And you should all be very proud to be part of the city of Tampa, to have a government that is willing to do this. I know of no other government that has of yet been that transparent in their dealings with the urban forest. So here we are today at the second time of development of an action plan, and you're going to hear the report on the assessment. Very quickly, this is specifically how the plan is attached to what you're going to see in terms of the analysis. Here's one of those 31 key objectives, right? Establish a tree population suitable for Tampa's urban environment and adapted to the regional environment, okay? This has to do with ensuring that the trees that exist within the city of Tampa are going to live out the length of their lives to the greatest extent possible, going to have less problems with diseases and insects, going to need less maintenance, going to be less costly, more efficient, and provide a greater service in terms of the benefits to the citizens of Tampa. So the question is, how do you measure whether you're doing this very well? Well, that's what we do with this ecological analysis. As Andrew will point out in just a moment, he is able to actually tell to what extent we're beginning to meet that key objective. And you can see these are performance indicators for that key objective. They are very, very specific and quantifiable. That's because when we do the analysis, we are being as specific as we can and as quantifiable as possible so that they match up properly. I want to introduce Dr. Andrew Kozer, my good friend Andrew. And Andrew's going to talk a little bit about the on-the-ground sampling and how the inventory was done.
Thank you, Rob.
You're welcome.
Click over here. So yes, before my time here, 11 years ago or 10 years ago, they started by laying out a grid work of permanent plots throughout the city to help us gauge an on-the-ground look of what the urban forest looks like. Shawn's going to show you some remote sensing stuff. You can get some really detailed canopy images. But unfortunately, for a lot of the information that we want, you have to be there on the ground in the swamps, looking at the trees and seeing what their conditions are. Rob mentioned that there was, swamps and swamp cypresses in North Tampa. They are still there. That's a picture of one of my students wading through a couple alligator nests to get there to do that plot center. So, fresh from West Virginia, wondering why he moved to Florida. So, but this grid work here, we have a mix of properties. Public, institutional, private, and it's a logistical nightmare to get to all these sites, but it's worth it for the data we collect. We're working with individual property owners to get on their property with McDill everywhere to get there and get our eyes on the trees. We use the iTree models to get at the ecosystem services I'll talk about before, and they use a modified FIA or forest inventory analysis sampling protocol using 10th acre plots to get at some of the model criteria that we're looking at. Once the crew gets to these sites, they have a whole range of things that they're going to be measuring. They're going to look around and see, even though we have an idea of what the land use is when we get there based on maps and zoning, sometimes there's a different story once you get to the site, and we mark that down. We look at ground cover, shrub cover, tree cover to see what the vertical structure is of the forest. What are the trees? What are the understory shrubs? What's the ground level? Is it grass or turf or what is it? To get a feel of the whole living system that's an urban forest. We also look at plantable spaces because we want to see how far can we grow. We're at, Shawn will tell you where we're at right now, but how much room more do we have to grow given our current development? We look at tree location. We have survey grade GPS so we can get back to the same trees year after year. But we even take it a step further and get the map and the compass out and fix it to permanent points like light posts and pace off things and get a really detailed view of everything that's in these plots. It's a lot of work, as my crew can attest to. We mark down the species down to the species level to figure out what is out there in our forest. We look at diameter, because diameter is one of those metrics that gives a sense of the tree's age. Trees have to grow every year or they die. So that gives us the bigger the tree, the older the tree is, in most cases, unless it's a very stunting environment. And that also is something that we factor into the carbon sequestration and carbon storage models. How much wood is there is how much carbon storage ability that tree has. Looking at the height of the tree, the crown width, and the height to the lower branches gives you a three-dimensional volume of canopy, and that's that filter that does a lot of the air pollution mitigation. That's shading your house. That's doing a lot of the good that trees do, and so that's why we look at the crown. But that three-dimensional volume is a very imperfect number. So what we do to get at better estimates is we have subtraction factors, things like dieback in the canopy. Do we have branches where the tree's kind of retrenching to a smaller size because it's older? Are there breaks in the canopy, or is it just a bunch of dead branches and twig ends that we have to account for to get a real sense of what the living filter is of that tree? And then we look at the impervious shrub cover, because if you get only at all the, because the forest is a three-dimensional kind of vertical thing, we have to account for the overlap, and we look at that so that we don't have more than 1/10 of an acre in our plot when it comes down to modeling. And then we look at things like distances to buildings. We anchor to a permanent structure when we look at their location, but it's not also a building. We look for the nearby buildings, and that goes into our equations to estimate how much trees help cool the urban forest down and lower your energy demand for your air conditioning. One of the things we talked about and we were introduced about is the problems that we have with pests and diseases. And a way that urban foresters can manage for that is to increase species diversity. If you look at the city of Tampa, we have 112 species that we recorded in this inventory. There's surely more, but these are the ones that we found in our plots. And that's a lot of species, honestly. I like to look at the natural areas and the conservation lands, because they kind of, Rob would argue with this, but they kind of give you a feel with, what the forest was beforehand. And in these areas, we recorded 32 different species. And then you compare that to, water and agriculture, you don't have trees there, that's a given. But look at things like residential single family. 78 species there. That's where you have people bringing in their citrus, their rare fruits from the sale down in Bradenton. All these things are coming into our backyards, and we're pushing boundaries and bringing new things in, and that shows up in our data. It's pretty cool. So this increased diversity gives us a little bit more resiliency for the storms, the pests, and things. And what we want to do is make sure that these trees are suited for our environment. If you want to look at the most common species, they range from the most common, which is white mangrove, 17% of your urban canopy, to the lowest and our most common is buttonbush, which is like an understory species. But things that you think that live oak are everywhere, right? They're only 2% of the stem counts for the city of Tampa. But they're a really hard-working 2%. We'll show you that in a little bit. Cypress, you may not notice this. You might see a few in people's backyards, but they're very common, especially in the swamps that people tend not to go into unless they have to, like my crew. So, and then things like cabbage palm, like 5%. So 1 in 20 trees is a cabbage palm, and you see those everywhere, sprouting up by fence posts and by power lines. But so we have a wide range of species. The mangroves are critically important for a lot of reasons. We like to keep them in our report to show that Tampa has this unique resource that is, that's working with it. But we also separate it out from time to time to show what the inland forest that we deal with every day is doing. But mangroves, 1 in 5 trees in Tampa is a mangrove of some sort, a white, a red, or a black. Despite this, they only occupy 2.7% of the land that are in the canopy in Tampa, actually, the canopy. So a lot of little trees, right? But they're all over the place, and they're a really critically important barrier, and it reduces erosion in our estuary areas, and it's critical habitat for a lot of things like redfish that I like to chase on the weekend. So back to the performance criteria. This is how they're arranged in the report. Rob kind of blew it up so you can see a really good example. But if you look at, this is our vegetation resource section in the Urban Forest Manual, and the key criteria for this one is to have a population of trees that is suitable for Tampa's climate, the first one. And we see here that if you look at it, you're at the moderate level, which is about 50 to 75% of the trees are acceptable for Tampa's climate. And you might have wondered what that meant. How could they not be suitable? But as we mentioned earlier, this cold snap we had this past winter was a reminder that not everything that we plant is going to make it long term. It may make it for 5 years, big enough to forget that, long enough that we forget that it is cold sensitive, but eventually it'll get caught. So we need to keep that in mind. Tree species diversity. One of the criteria is that there's a rule that the rule of thumb, I would say, that you want less than 10% of a given species to be, or less than 10% of your trees to be a given species. Because you really don't want to be overly reliant on one species and have Texas Phoenix palm decline come through and wipe it out, right? And Tampa's doing really well. If you exclude the mangroves and the white mangrove, which was 17% in the last slide, no other species is above that 10% threshold, which moves Tampa up to the optimal level on this specific goal. And if you look at longevity, there are so many plants out there that they just go up in a flurry, grow really quick, and then die off within a few decades, maybe 2 or 3, like moringa or something like that. When we looked at this, we want to see that we have a sustaining, long-lasting urban forest that doesn't have to be maintained every 30 years for removals. And if you look at where we are now, between 50 and 75% of those trees meet that kind of criteria of long-livedness. And so we're at the good level for that criteria. We can look at things like density of plants. Look at the mangroves. We had to put a little break in the bar graph to get it on there because it's just far and above every other species out there in our mangrove lands. You look at if you look at our parks, I think that's a good one. You know what a park setting is for trees? That's a spacing that we find aesthetically pleasing. It's not too dense. There's enough canopy but we don't feel closed in. Well, that's kind of mirrored in our residential areas, that same planting. And it's a little bit higher than the city is overall. So on average, the city's a pretty welcoming scenario. And landscape architects and folks take advantage of that density when they plan cities and new developments. You look at the age of our city. I said that diameter is often a good proxy for age. If you look at it, if you take it mangroves in, take them out, doesn't matter. Tampa has what we classify as a young urban forest. You definitely have old trees that are 500 years old or more in the city, but they're rare compared to what we have elsewhere. So, we have this reverse J curve, or everything's skewed to the left a little bit. This is showing that we have a lot of small diameter trees in Tampa. And part of it's because there's active planting programs. Tremendous Tampa's planting trees throughout the city. Another part of it is there's small stature trees that are quite common, like Brazilian pepper, all over any place you don't mow them down. So there's a lot of things contributing to this, but it's a relatively young forest that's actually quite common for a lot of urban areas in the United States. And then citywide health. The city of Tampa overall has over 80% of their trees that are in good or excellent condition when we look at the dieback ratings that we collect for iTree, which is pretty good. And you can see here, I thought this was pretty interesting. Apparently they've seen this before. I'm the newest one on the group. If you look at these patterns, parks and recreation lands, public communication lands, public institutional lands, residential multifamily units, and public right-of-ways, these are all the above average health areas. So, see a pattern there? They're managed by someone else. They're managed by the city, or they're managed by the property owner company. And these are the ones that we tend to have the better trees, because we're actively managing them, and because we're removing the things that need to come down. So, and then our health criteria is, we're at moderate for this, because when they created this particular criteria, they were only looking at the excellent trees, and they have between 30 and 60 that are excellent. If they would change it, which is something people could do, to include good and excellent, you'd move up a level. So, and with that, I'll move on to Shawn Landry, and Shawn will talk about the first part of his work, which is the newest canopy coverage analysis.
Great, thanks. Well, thank you. So I'm gonna show some maps, and I'm gonna defer you to the future reports where there's gonna be a lot more information for you, but we can't cover everything at the level that I'm going to show you as possible during this session here. So I'm going to talk about two different things, two different aspects of this monitoring work that we've been doing. One of them is to map out tree canopy and other land covers. So where are the trees located in the city of Tampa? Where are there opportunities for planting? And then I'm going to also look at tree canopy change. And these are two different things. The tree canopy change can tell you since 2006 to 2011 to 2016 exactly what has happened with the trees within the entire city and then within each of the planning districts themselves. And so these are different methods, and I'll explain why these are different methods as we go through, and hopefully you'll bear with me for the concept of uncertainty that we inevitably have to get to. So when we map the tree canopy, and you might have seen on that first slide that showed the project partners, we have our partner from University of Vermont, and the reason he's on this team is because he literally is the one who develops a lot of these methods. They're very advanced methods, But we use them in Tampa because we map every 6 inches of the city to say, what is it? Is it tree, or is it grass, or is it a building or a road? And with all that information, we can slice and dice this data up a whole bunch of different ways beyond what I'm ever going to talk about here. So we bring together things like aerial photographs. You've all seen Google Earth or Google Maps, and you've seen the aerial images. And then we have what's called LiDAR, and some of you are probably familiar with LiDAR, and that tells us about the height of everything. And so I like to say, if you thought about how would you recognize a tree with those two pieces of information, you'd say, first, is it green? If it's green, it's probably vegetation. If it's tall, it's probably a tree. And that's exactly how we try to get the computer to do it. The problem is computers are not nearly as smart about doing it as we are. And so it takes a lot of effort to get the computer to actually do it accurately. So that's what we've done. This sort of just shows you a mashup of what the final maps end up looking like. There we go. So in the report that we'll present, and this will also be an interactive website where you'll be able to zoom in to different areas of the city, but essentially this shows that we map out every 6 inches of the city for the types of land cover that's listed there: water, tree canopy, grass, buildings, bare earth, and other impervious surfaces. And of course, through that we can quantify the amount of tree canopy in different areas. But we can also look at other issues. And the accuracy of this type of mapping is sort of limited at around 92% right now, which is good, but it's not perfect. And that's just the nature of this kind of work. So again, a lot of the information that in the longer term, over the next 5 years, we'll make use of is the fact that we can take all of this tree canopy mapping and slice it up to analyze every single parcel in the city of Tampa. Why is that useful? Because then we can look at issues of how our tree canopy, how's the amount different for different land uses or zoning or land development classes or future land uses. We can look at how it differs by the size of a house or building, about a lot of these other issues where we can ask a question and then dig into this data that's going to be available to try to answer those questions. So one way we can look at this is by this kind of our version of land use. This is not the same as zoning, to be clear, but our version of sort of the general land use within the city. What does it look like if we start to look at the tree canopy and grass and shrub and bare earth and these other land covers? One of the things that you see is that some of the highest amounts of tree canopy are on, well, mangrove, you probably could guess that, natural conservation lands, those old forests that are out there, but also residential single-family land uses. So, and this is going to keep popping up. Tree canopy is highest in these areas on a percentage basis, at least. But another thing that some of this information tells us, if we start to look at those areas, we might realize that we want to plant some trees in a particular area. Maybe they lost trees to some larger developments or storms or issues like this. And we say, where can we plant trees? Well, one of the easier places to plant trees is where there's existing grass or shrub as opposed to where there's impervious surfaces or buildings. So it's a lot easier to plant in the right-of-way in front of somebody's house and in their lawn than it is to plant in a road or on a building, of course, right? So this amount of grass shrub, this shows us possible spaces, the low-hanging fruits where we might consider planting trees if in areas we're looking to do that. So there's a lot of information here, again, that is going to be in the report that you can make use of over time. If we examine this data a different way, if we look at the total acres of tree canopy in the city, we see that by far residential single-family land use has the largest acreage of tree canopy in the city of Tampa. And so, that's important when we think about how we're educating people about trees and managing trees. It's largely the property owners of residential homes that are managing the forest in the city of Tampa, right? So that's pretty important. Another thing that you might find surprising, if you look at the right-of-way, there's a large amount in terms of acreage of trees in the right-of-way, and sometimes that's not always intuitive. You think it's a roadway, but actually it's a roadway surrounded by some right-of-way area, and it has various configurations. And there's also a lot of grass and shrub in those same right-of-way areas that potentially, again, areas where trees potentially could be planted. So again, these are some of the areas with a large amount. And again, this information's been divided up into a number of different ways in the report because it corresponds with the different ways that land is regulated and managed in the city. And so zoning is an important one for any kind of development. And we can see we've looked at, if we look at the total amount of tree canopy in the city, planned development areas, a lot of those areas are up in the New Tampa area, make up a large portion. But also, again, coming back to the residential single-family land uses, they make up a huge portion of the tree canopy. It's not shown here, but we also look at by neighborhood association. Everybody's interested in sort of their neighborhood, and there's a lot of neighborhood associations in Tampa, I guess 97 as of the time we did this. And you can see the largest amount of acreage of tree canopy is in the Tampa Palms North, and then Seminole Heights, which is surprising. And you can see that, that list. But again, this is where in the report you'll be able to see all of the neighborhoods listed and get a sense of what's in there. And also, again, some of these numbers, when we put them in the report, they'll include the amount of grass shrub, which can give you an indication, well, you may not have a lot of tree canopy right now, but if you really wanted to increase trees in your neighborhood, it can kind of give you a sense of whether that's possible or not. And then we get real geeky. And we do things like that my students like to do. And this is showing you, and the reason I put this up is really to show you that the level of analysis is feasible to do if you have questions related to this. One of them is, does the amount of tree canopy decrease when house sizes increase? Sort of a logical idea, right? Bigger houses, you might think, well, does that mean smaller amounts of canopy? What you see is, does this work? Yeah. What you see is that this shows that, yes, there's a decrease in tree canopy as house sizes increase, right? This is house size, and this is tree canopy. So there is a decrease. But at a point at about 3,000 square feet, it more or less evens out, more or less evens out. So it is feasible to have large houses and a lot of canopy. It's not outside the realm of possibilities. And this is, again, is analysis. This is analyzing 80,000 parcels, residential parcels. So this excludes all the other parcels. But again, these are the types of analyses you can do at the parcel level by having access to this resolution of data. You can also look at this. We social scientists, and I count myself as somewhat of one. We love to look at socio-demographic information. And so one question we looked at is, well, and this is a question that people ask all the time, is that, so homeowners have a reason to invest in their property, but what about owners of rental properties? Some people might say, well, you're likely to expect that rental areas with large proportion of renters are going to have less canopy because people aren't investing as much. And indeed, I mean, that's not necessarily the reason why there's less canopy, but indeed that's the case you find here. It could be that there's a different land use altogether. They're larger buildings. They're multi-family complexes and things like that. But so we can look at, at the census data as well, and slice and dice this information to try to answer some questions, or maybe want to pinpoint some planting efforts in certain neighborhoods where they need a little help. These are the ways we can look at this information. So the next part of this was looking at tree canopy change. So I showed you all those maps, and you might say, well, why don't we just compare maps from one year to the next? And there's a good reason for this. And it's, if you look at Raymond James Stadium here, and look at the images, and you try to pick out, in 2006, try to pick out the lines on the field. You can't see them, right? You can start to see them, in 2011. Apparently there was a Florida game, I guess, or something going on. But they're pretty clear in 2016. And this shows what the problem is, that we're always improving these methods. The imagery is improving, and the methods are improving. And we want to take advantage of the best method to get the best map we can possibly get each year. But we can't really compare the map we did this year with the map we did 10 years ago, because of this reason right here. It's a different, it would give you a different result just because the imagery is different, just because the method's different. So the way we solve that is we use what's called the dot-based method. And this is a method going back a long time, but this is developed by the US Forest Service. And essentially what it is you put a point down, you put lots and lots and lots of points down. And what you do is, so this is a point right here, and you say, is that tree canopy or not? And so if you put enough points down, you remember your basic statistics, you can take the average of those points, and it's going to tell you how much tree canopy there is in the city of Tampa. And the nice thing about this method with these points is that this is not really sensitive to the differences in images that I just showed you. Because the human eye is far more powerful than the computer. And the human eye can recognize the context of where that's located, and you can detect, yes, that's a tree canopy. Even if it is a small one, I can see the signature of a tree canopy because I've trained my eye enough to do it. And so by using these points, we put down, there's actually well over 4,000 of them. And this is based on a bunch of analysis we've done and other people have done to figure out how many points do you need. So I won't go into those details, but suffice it to say, and trust me when I say my graduate student can attest to the fact that this is plenty of points, because he examined he actually examined 9,000 points in the city of Tampa for 3 different sets of imagery. So every image, he looked at every one of those points. And then he left. I don't know why. No, I'm just kidding. He graduated. And this is the result that we have when we look at citywide tree canopy and how it's changed. And these bars represent the fact that nothing's perfect. This is uncertainty. But what you see is that in 2006, based on this analysis, which keeps things consistent, you see 31.7% tree canopy was the average, but there's a little range around that takes into account that uncertainty. And then you can see that there was an increase, slight increase into 2011, and then a slight decrease to 2016. But if you look at the error associated with that, what you see is that there's overlap, which means we can't say statistically for certain there was a significant increase or decrease. We can say something about the general trend, So there was definitely a rise from 2006 to 2011, and it appears to be a small decline to 2016. But again, within those confidence limits, there's not any kind of major change happening for sure. So again, a slight increase, and then a slight decline. And that's not what you want to see, but again, it's not it's only a slight one. So how does, another thing we can look at is how, and I'll come back to the breaking it down by some areas of the city, but how does Tampa compare with other US cities where tree canopy has been measured? And this, I only filtered out the ones where I'm familiar with the method, and I have confidence that it was reasonably comparable with the methods we were using. What you see, you see a large range, but I tried to highlight the southern, so some of the southeastern cities. And, Tampa's 32% right here is pretty good compared. It's higher than Miami. I mean, when you think about Savannah, if you've been there, you know that that's trees all over the place, and they don't worry about sidewalks being buckled and all that. So, but then Jacksonville, that's a little misleading because it's a larger area. Jacksonville includes part of the county, so you don't want to put too much into that. And similar to Atlanta, Atlanta's the larger area as well. So, but if you look at Tampa on this, Tampa's pretty respectable. You might have seen, or you might see the news today. It was rehashed data that showed the Tampa was #1 in terms of most trees. The Business Insider magazine for International Tree Day, I think it was, they sort of produced or put out the numbers that the MIT lab had generated. And when you see those numbers, the one thing to remember, it says that Tampa was #1, which is great, good news for Tampa. But it was, and it showed a value of 36%. That number, the way they do that analysis is they look at how much green there is using Google Street View images. So how much green is there at ground level? And that's a useful information. How much green do we see when we walk around? It's very useful. It's a little biased though, because when you see those numbers, number one, the only reason Tampa's there is because I asked the person to analyze Tampa, because I know that person and I've reviewed his article and he presented at my talks, and so that's why Tampa's there. But also it's all the other cities on that list, they don't have, they have winters. And so there's lots of the cities that don't actually have full coverage of all those Google Street View images, because some of them were in the winter when there's no green. But it's still good publicity, so it's neat to see, right? We're up there with Singapore and all these other major metropolitan areas, so it's good. So then we can look at by planning district, and this is an important one because some of the metrics related, or performance indicators, are geared towards planning districts, and this is how some of the regulations are thought of in the city. And so what we see, and again, this is, one way of looking at it is these are the planning districts. They're labeled in the map up here. And then this is 2006, 2011, 2016, and you can see how they change. You can also just look at the graph. And so what you see is there was in all areas, there was a slight increase from 2006 to 2011. And then you see that most areas, there was a minimal, very, very minimal change, whether it's an increase in that area, a minimal decrease there, minimal increase there. Again, but none of it that's significant in terms of we look within the error there. It's all relatively unchanged since 2011. But there are some trends that are not in the direction that you necessarily want to see. And so those are some of the areas that you can take a closer look at. So we come back to the performance criteria, and the way that this has been looked at is this idea of no net loss. And so because those areas remained fairly unchanged, statistically, we can say that it's in the optimal level right now. And it was in the optimal level in 2011. And so that's the good direction you want to be. And so we just need to look at some of those areas perhaps where there does appear to be some decline, and make sure that that's not that's not really what's happening. So we're going to go back to Dr. Kozer and talk about some of the ecosystem services now.
Great, thanks, John. So I mentioned before, we measured a lot of different things at each of these plots. And the reason we had that big laundry list of things to take down in our inventory was to feed into some of these models that we're going to show you today. And I just kind of highlighted a few of them. There's more in the report that will be released, but these all come from the USDA Forest Service, Dave Nowak, who worked with Gore's team with the climate change project that he got the Nobel Prize with. He's a really respected researcher, but these models are models that are meant for use, and every model can be wrong. It's just something to take whenever you see these numbers. So, trees they perform a lot of services, right? We talked about the aesthetic one's the one that everyone really looks at right away. They instantly know. You plant a tree in your yard because it looks pretty, or maybe it gives you some fruit or something, And the rest of this all comes as the added bonus. These are the extra services that come with trees just naturally. So things like, increasing property value. Shawn's going to talk about this next, and it's pretty cool research that Jeff Donovan helped us with the USD Forest Service. But there's a lot of research that shows that properties sell faster if they have trees, and for a higher price, you can sell rentals for a higher price. Looking at things like rainwater infiltration rates. We talked about that before. If you can slow down rain, it has a chance to infiltrate at the site where it's falling rather than running straight into a gutter and having to be managed somehow by the city later on. Either through stormwater retention ponds, or some cities actually treat their rainwater, which gets pretty costly. So energy savings, we talked about the proximity of the buildings. Well, if you have a tree shading your house or your AC unit, that can really help you with your energy costs. Though interestingly, I think the studies show that if you have a bunch of kids in your house, that goes right out the window because they leave the doors open all the time, So, and that overwhelms any benefit trees can have. And I have 4 girls, so I can attest to that. Looking at air quality, trees are giant filters. They, all the dust and the particulates that come out of exhaust, they collect in the leaves, and then they slowly filter down with rain events. Things like, carbon sequestration and carbon storage. We talk about global warming or climate change, whatever you want to call it or not call it. Trees take in CO2 and they store it in their wood long term. And there's the annual action of sequestering that, and then there's the long-term storage in the woody parts of the tree. So we'll start with that one, carbon sequestration. Annually, the trees in Tampa's urban forests sequester 62,000 tons of carbon. If you look at that and you want to put that in perspective of what we emit, that's the same as about 612,000 cars running annually in the city. Or the same as 251 houses, the heating and cooling costs, the carbon associated with the electric generation and any gas burning, that's the same offset. Or if you want to look at the city as a whole, it's about half of what the city emits every year. This carbon offset, the sequestration, will suck up the same carbon that is emitted in the city in 178 days. So it's working for you. Carbon storage, I said the storage is in the wood of the tree, right? This is the bank. So if we can find ways to keep trees standing longer, we store that carbon longer. The moment you start chipping it up and making mulch out of it, it goes right back into the atmosphere. We talked about the trees that are out there. We said that by stem count, live oak is about 2% of the trees in Tampa. But look who's doing all the work. They're doing, the vast majority of the carbon is stored in our large oaks and our cypresses. Cypresses can get really big. We don't normally see that, and it can be really shrubby, but some of the biggest ones are here in Florida. So, and then, as you move down, part of there's fewer of the trees lower down there, and some are just smaller. So it's a combination of size and abundance. Energy savings. You know, when you're in Hyde Park, you can see where your energy comes from, right? That's kind of a gift that not everyone gets. You can't look away from it, you know, and you know where it is coming from. And when you look at where the energy savings come from in Florida, it's mostly through AC savings, you know? And there's a little bit of, you know, a burden associated with shading in the winter. You don't get that solar gain where you'd actually warm up your house, but it's more than offset by the actual savings and air conditioning costs. If we look at it, we're looking at about $8 million in savings for reduced energy demand in the city. I'm sorry, the number's a little small for the screen. So you look at avoided runoff. You know, if you have to actively capture and, you know, even treat in some cases stormwater, there's a cost to the taxpayers of the city. Well, trees can help take care of that a little bit, and they do that by just slowing the system down and keeping the water on site. And we know that flooding can be an issue, and we've seen in South Tampa and elsewhere. That will only be exacerbated if you lose some of the potential that that trees have to hold water, especially for smaller events. So ecosystem services. If you had to replace the urban forest as it is, like say a storm wiped it all out, and or some pest, and you want to replant it to get to where you were, the value of that, the cost of that to get to that level was $183 million. You know, so, and it's been put in there, plant by plant, person by person, volunteering in some cases on its own accord. And if to think about having to replace it all is a pretty big burden. Energy conservation, again, mostly through cooling of our buildings, is about $8 million. Air pollution mitigation, that's valued at about $9 million, and that comes mostly from avoided health costs. You know, so if you can filter our particulates that are coming off of, you know, our vehicles and elsewhere, and keep them out of the lungs of the Tampa residents, you can avoid health issues, especially with asthma and things like that. Again, you trade that off for the pollen that we deal with every spring, but you know they do filter a lot of things that would bother you year-round. And then avoided runoff is valued at about $3 million, and that iTreat normally uses a treatment cost, so that's the cost of treating water. It's about 1 cent a gallon. So when you factor all that together, the benefits plus the actual value of the forest itself, it comes to about $300 million, you know, in an asset that's right there. Some of it comes in annually, some of it's just the value of the thing as a whole long term, but it's quite an asset for the city. So, but one thing I wanted to leave you with is this. We talked about diversity before, right? And we talked about how some of the benefits, actually many of the benefits, are related to the crown itself. And while we have 112 species in the city, 8 species do 60% of the work, right? So we have live oak, laurel oak, cabbage palm, you know, queen palm, cypress. Those are the trees that are abundant enough and are big enough to be creating all these benefits. And when you think about Texas Phoenix palm decline, queen palm and cabbage palm are both susceptible to it. We could talk about, you know, oak wilt in Texas, but we're not going to. No, it's not coming, it's not coming. So, but these are things that we want to keep actively managing. I know everyone loves oaks, but we need to think about other species if we want to maintain a more, you know, resilient urban forest for years to come. So, with that, back to Shawn.
All right. Well, so this will be the last portion before we go into some questions. So we'll be happy to. We have a lot of time to answer questions. One of the things we wanted to look at, and others have looked at in the past, is quantifying what the value is of a tree in the context of selling your house. You know, we've seen some different ways that trees can be quantified in terms of their values. Carbon what's the, we know how much carbon Tampa's forest stores, but what's the value of carbon? And the numbers we use were pretty conservative, but those numbers can change. They differ. And then other services, those economic part of the equation can be variable sometimes. What we wanted to look at is what is the value really to the sale of actual houses, right? So there's this method that's used, and I could point to dozens of publications by scientists all over the world. These are mostly economists who love crunching numbers. And what they try to look at is called this hedonic pricing analysis. It's the idea that when you are trying to value a house, how do you know how much a bedroom is worth? How do you know how much a bathroom is worth? You know because houses have sold with X number of bathrooms and X number of bedrooms over years and years and years, and you have a long history of knowing how to quantify those values. Things like trees don't normally enter into those equations. They're not normally quantified as such. So we don't normally, we're not normally able to say, well, this tree is worth this much to the sales price of a home. Like we can say this bedroom, X number of bedrooms will be worth this amount. So the way that we do this in the hedonic pricing is we put together all of the variables that are well known to contribute to the sales price of a house. And then, so we're accounting for all of those different variables, and then we add in measures of the trees. And that's what a hedonic pricing analysis is. It's a statistical kind of analysis. And so, let's see. A lot of information on this slide, so I apologize for that. But, and one of the colleagues we worked with on this project was Jeff Donovan from the US Forest Service. He's in Portland, Oregon. But he's published a number of studies. He's an economist, a natural resources economist. So he crunches numbers all the time. He just spent a year in New Zealand where he had access to healthcare information about every person in the country and was crunching those numbers to find out what was the relationship with all kinds of different environmental variables. And so he loves crunching numbers. So I said, hey, you want to come to Tampa and crunch some numbers with me? And so he said, yeah, sure. He loves doing it. So we'll be producing a peer-reviewed article as well from this. But this is the summary here. What we did was we looked at all homes that were sold between May of 2015 and May of 2016. Why is that? Because basically our tree canopy numbers were from approximately that time frame in 2016. So we figured let's look at everything that's sold within a relatively small window around that. We used all of the property data from the Hillsborough County Property Appraiser's Office, and we had met personally with the former, what was his title? I don't know, Tim Wilmeth, who handled property valuation, and he shared his statistics about showing exactly what they use to figure out how they assess properties. So we knew these are the parameters that are definitely important. One of them being location, we'll get to in a minute. But we excluded all new construction, because obviously that's a whole different ballpark. We just looked at all of the single-family properties that sold in that period, excluding new construction, and it was basically 4,800 properties that were in the analysis. So it's a fairly large data set. More is always better, but it's a fairly large one. Then we looked at two different tree canopy variables. We wanted to see what's the value of trees that are growing on that property. And then we also wanted to see, well, what's the kind of the neighborhood tree canopy worth as well. So when a house, you think of that one house that's shown by that little yellow, right? This one property, we looked at the amount of tree canopy on that property, or rather associated with trees growing from that property. We actually again, my poor graduate student had to go to all of these properties and figure out which of the what tree canopy was originating from trees growing on the property as opposed to tree canopy overlapping the property from neighboring houses. And yeah, he doesn't talk to me anymore. So then we looked at the neighborhood, and by neighborhood, we kind of define this as 500 feet from the property. Somewhat of an arbitrary number, 500 feet, but it gives you a sense of the neighborhood. There's about 60 homes kind of overall in that area. And so if we look at this one example, you see that there's 31% tree canopy on that property, but then there's 55% in that general neighborhood, right? So those two numbers we thought would be important. Previous work had suggested that sometimes it is the property, having trees right on the property have a high value, and in others it's more of the neighborhood context. You think Hyde Park, you drive around, lots of trees, lots of canopy, there's a certain feel you get in that neighborhood that isn't necessarily related to one property at a time, it's more of the whole neighborhood. So we wanted to quantify that. The attributes we included, and the report will have all of the statistics. Actually, I'll blind you with them in a second, but location factors, there's lots of things about location, school district you're in, tax district, all kinds of things. The way the property appraiser does it and the way that we did it was we used their neighborhood definitions, not the neighborhood association boundaries that I showed you earlier, but these are the actual neighborhoods that are used by the property appraiser's office to help them figure out valuations. And so that kind of accounts for a lot of those miscellaneous things that relate to location, concept. And then all these others that are real common sense. Number of bedrooms, bathrooms, number of stories, the square footage, acreage of the house, the year it was built, architectural style, roof type of air conditioning, and then whether or not the home was on waterfront or not. So again, these are all kind of a long list. These are the ones that were identified as being important by the property appraiser, and so those are the ones that we included. And this is what I mean by blinding you with the statistics. I'm not going to talk about these, but we tried different types of statistics that account for spatial variation and autocorrelation and all these other things that statisticians love writing books about and everything. And it just goes to show you that it was really pretty robust. And at the end of the day, what you see is these numbers right here that are so similar. These are four really different approaches to account for sort of the statistics, and these numbers are essentially the same. So it shows you that numbers, we can have a pretty strong confidence in that. And what is that number? So when we look at, first and foremost, the one thing we found when we put all these variables together, we look at trees originating on the property versus the trees in that 500-foot area. It's the trees in that, what I'm going to call neighborhood, that were statistically significant. That was that was what was important. The trees on the property in that analysis, in that context of sales, was not as important as the trees in the neighborhood. So when you included the trees in the neighborhood, it far outweighed trees on the property. So it shows you that it's sort of it's about more than just the single property. The way we quantified it, because we were looking at tree canopy, we started with, so a 1% increase in canopy or difference in canopy in that neighborhood essentially adds $155 to $164 to the sale of every single home in that same area. There's 60 homes in that area, so it's not, so that 1% difference essentially is adding to the sales price of every one of those homes, every one of those 60 homes. 10% difference would add $1,500 to every home in that area. It's hard to think about, though, tree canopy, a 1% amount in that area. What does that mean? So we tried to, well, I'll get to that in a minute, I guess. Getting ahead of myself. So when we looked at, the combined amount, in that neighborhood. So the combined contribution to the sales, if all 60 homes sold at one time, which I guess if that happened, it's probably major problems going on, and probably nothing would be worth anything. But if all those homes did sell, that 1% difference would be $9,200 overall. Not a huge amount, but then again, 1% is not a huge amount. So differences, I'll show you an example in a minute. There's much greater differences. 10% adds $92,000. We then took the field data that we collected in Tampa, and we looked at how many trees are there in a certain amount of tree canopy. So we could kind of translate percent tree canopy to number of trees. And that way we could say, well, what's the value of a single tree? And so when we do that, we looked at it two different ways. We looked at the just average size tree. We took the data from the field plots of single family homes, those plots that were located in those same residential neighborhoods. We said we know how much tree canopy there is on those plots, and then we know how many trees there are. So we can say X number of trees have this much canopy, and we convert those numbers. And what we get at is one average size tree adds a little over $1,300 to the overall sales of all those homes. One mature oak adds $2,000 to the combined sales. So the trees are when you add these numbers up, they can be fairly substantial. Whether or not that how that relates to adding another bedroom is a different story altogether. There's probably bedrooms probably, I would imagine, worth more than these values, but these are the trees, and this is kind of what they're worth in that context of sales. If we kind of try to look at, well, what does this mean if, in different neighborhoods? And so I just threw up this, again, arbitrary example here. Similar area of town, South Tampa area. You look at new suburb, Beautiful versus Palmacia. And really the numbers to look at is just, it's 58% tree canopy versus 40% tree canopy in the neighborhood. So based on this analysis, you say that trees in new suburb Beautiful add about $9,000 to the sales price of every home, just by the context of that neighborhood, the trees. And then in Palmacia, it's about $6,100. So more canopy is contributing, more value in terms of the sales when you factor in all of the other issues that affect sales price. So that's one way of thinking about this. And that is all we have. Do you want to go back?
Correction, yeah. So I was instantly pounced on when I got back to my seat. So a little context. Last week, I spent 3 full days reading 80 pages of this report. And then I got done, and I was like, yes, done. And Shawn was like, okay, now condense it down to 10 slides. So, and I grabbed the wrong number, and it was a big wrong number. So I'm going to go back to make a correction. And that's why we work in groups, because it's your first peer review right there. So this right here, that first value, the structural value, that's the standard error for the structural value. The standard error, that's how much we are off. The actual structural value is $2 billion, which when you think about the number, it's like $183 million to replace all the trees in Tampa, and I knew it when I was saying it. It's like, that's what the FDOT paid for the the landscaping program, on the highways, so like, I lowballed it a little bit, so I apologize for that. The report's right. I just have to be a little embarrassed right now. So, but thank you very much.
Okay, so we do have we do have a little time that we can answer questions pertaining to the analysis and the inventory. All other questions that you might have concerning your urban forest management plan, ordinance writing, public policy, that's a different conversation that you're welcome to have with the good folks in the city of Tampa. And on the way in or the way out, you can grab a sheet and it'll tell you how to send your questions in and get answers and talk to people.